Good evening, everyone. I trust you've had a fruitful day. I do not say happy, though I hope it has been happy. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Buddha, the blessed, noble, and fully self-awakened one. So yesterday we met Diganaka, who was a thinker, too much lost in his thought, and the Buddha got him to become fully liberated eventually by grounding him in the body and in feeling, just to get him off his head, and to recognize that the path to liberation is using a different faculty that we call our intuitive intelligence, our intuition. Now here in Magandiya, we have a different sort. Magandiya is a hedonist. And there's a quote from William Blake from his book, Proverbs of Hell. That's right, that's it. Proverbs of Hell. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. You never know what is enough until you know what is more than enough. And that rings true, especially for me personally, because like I think most people, you go through a period in your youth of in your younger days of drinking a little too much. And now, of course, we don't touch the drop, of course. But in those days, and I remember waking up in the morning, lying on the pavement with my head actually in the gutter, and I struggled up and made my way to a local cemetery which was just down the road. It was very fortunate because I lay on top of a grave and considered deeply the ridiculousness of getting absolutely palatic. That's the word we used in those days. And I made a decision that from then on I would only get tipsy, and I kept it, and life was much better. So the road of excess can lead to the palace of wisdom. And here we have Magandiya, and he meets the Buddha in Kuru country. That's up towards Delhi. That's a long way from Benares, from from the Ganges all the way up to Delhi. So you can see how far the Buddha would walk. Probably take a lift in ox carts and stuff, but generally speaking, walking. So he's made his way, and he's staying in the fire chamber of a Brahmin belonging to the Bharadvaja clan, and the Brahmin has spread out this grass mat as a bed. You see. Now I presume that where is it? A fire chamber would be the warm place in the house where you had the fire. I presume that's like the front room or something, or the sitting room. And Magandiya is out walking. He's a wanderer, so he's also a samana, which is odd because you would have thought that somebody who's devoted to the pleasurable life would be a layperson trying to make money and to have a good time. But he is actually a wanderer, a samana. And when he walks in there, he says, "For whom is this bed of grass made for?" And the Brahmin answers, "Oh," he said, "it seems like the bed of a recluse." And the Brahmin says, "Oh yes, it is for Master Gautama, you see." And he says he has a very good reputation. He's the blessed one, accomplished, fully enlightened, perfect in true knowledge and conduct, sublime, knower of the worlds, incomparable, leader of persons to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, enlightened and blessed. That's whom I prepared this bed for. And Bharadvaja says, Well, this is a very sad sight indeed, because this is the bed of a life destroyer. So he's heard that the Buddha, of course, is all into restraint and into relinquishment and renunciation. So he calls it a destroyer of life. So anyway, it would seem that the Buddha knows all this because of his divine ear. So he's able to hear what people are saying when it concerns him, I should think. And when he finally returns, he greets the Brahmin, of course, and he says to him, Bharadvaja, did you have any conversation with the wanderer Magandiya about this bed of grass? And of course, the Brahmin was awestruck and his hair stood on end and replied, we wanted to tell Master Gotama about this very thing, but Master Gotama has anticipated us. This discussion was left because Magandiya turns up, you see, exchanging greetings, courteous and amiable talk. The Buddha launches into this teaching about, reminds him what he's just said. So this must have come as quite a surprise to Magandiya, because he said to him, with reference to me, you said the recluse Gotama is a life ruiner, a life destroyer. And it was with reference to Master Gotama that I did say this, he said. And why is that? Because it's recorded in the scriptures, in what we've learned. So then the Buddha says, well, the eye delights in form, takes delight in form, rejoices in form. That has been tamed by the Tathagata, guarded, protected, and restrained, and he teaches the Dharma for its restraint, for the restraint of indulgence. Remember, it's always indulgence. It's not that you're trying to restrain the process of seeing. And then he runs through the rest of the senses. These are just the basic 5 sensual chords, as they're known. And it is exactly with reference to this that the recluse Gotama is a destroyer of life. Why is that? Because it's recorded. So now the Buddha tries to get him to think differently by giving a couple of the usual similes or stories. So what do you think? Someone formerly enjoyed themselves with forms cognizable by the eye, so what you can see, agreeable, likable, etc. And on a later occasion, having understood the origin, disappearance, gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of what we see, he might abandon craving for those things, remove fever for them, and abide without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. So now, just note that the origin, disappearance, and then this gratification, the danger, and the escape. So what do you think of that, you see? And the answer that Magandiya is nothing, Master Gotama. I didn't think anything of it at all. And then the Buddha runs through the other 4 senses. Now, so he says, what do you think of that? And Magandiya says, nothing. I don't think anything about it. So Magandiya, the Buddha then talks about himself. He says, well, I lived at home. I enjoyed myself, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. Likeable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of lust. And then he says, on a later occasion, having understood as they actually are the origin, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of sensual pleasure, I abandoned craving for sensual pleasure. I removed the fever for them. I abide without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. I see other beings who are not free from lust for sensual pleasure, greed for sensual pleasure, devoured by craving for sensual pleasure, burning with fever for sensual pleasure, indulging in sensual pleasure. And I do not envy them, nor do I delight therein. Why is that? Because there is a delight apart from sensual pleasure, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses this particular, even divine bliss. So he's pointing to Nibbana. So all these sensual pleasures and even the pleasures of meditation through the jhana are surpassed by the bliss of Nibbana. Since I take delight in that, I do not envy the inferior, nor do I delight in them. And then he gives an example. Supposing a householder with great wealth and property, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of sensual pleasure, and on the dissolution of his body, he ends up in a heavenly world with a retinue of the 33, surrounded by a group of nymphs in the Nandana grove. This reminds you of the 72 virgins awaiting jihadi martyrs. And he would enjoy himself with the divine sensual pleasure. Now, then he asks, what do you think? Would that young god, surrounded by a group of nymphs in the Nandana grove, enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of divine sensual pleasure, envy the householder for the 5 chords of human sensual pleasure? Would he return to the human sensual pleasures? No, Master Gautama. Magandiya says, of course, that the divine pleasures are much more excellent and sublime. And then the Buddha talks about himself. Yes. And then he talks about himself, that he had formerly lived like this and that he had woken up to the dangers. Then he gives a simile around a leper. When I traveled to India for the first time, there were lots of people, say in Calcutta, in Delhi and whatnot, who were seriously ill with all sorts of illnesses, just lying in the streets, and some of them were dying, I presume. But the most pitiable of them was the leper. Very rarely came across them. When they came, they were always shrouded, always seemingly enclosed in upon themselves. Really, really sorry sight. I think these days there are colonies for them. And of course, it's a bacterial disease. It can actually be cured. So this gives you an idea of what it was like in those days. The leper with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs off the opening of his wounds with his nails, cauterizing his body over a burning charcoal pit. I believe that it can be very itchy, and sometimes by putting your fingers or the part of the limb that's really itching onto something really, that's going to burn it or cauterize it, it takes that away. But there's a lot of pain in leprosy. And then his friends and companions would bring a physician to him, and the physician would make medicine and cure his leprosy, and he'd become well, happy, and independent. Then he might see another leper with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured, etc., etc. What do you think? Would that man envy that leper for his burning charcoal pit and his use of medicine? Say, no, of course not. Because when there is sickness, medicine has to be made. And when there's no sickness, medicine does not have to be made. So it's a case of when somebody is cured of, when the leper is cured of his disease, he obviously does not envy when he sees a leper having to put his limbs against charcoal in order to cure the itching. And then he says, well, again, with the leper, with all these sores scratching at his limbs and all that, then once he's been cured by this medicine, 2 strong men would seize him by both arms and drag him towards a burning charcoal pit. What do you think, Magandiya? Would that man twist his body this way and that? Would he try to escape? Well, yes, of course he would, you see. So what do you think? Is it only now that the fire is painful to touch, hot and scorching? Or previously too was the fire painful to touch, hot and scorching? So Master Gautama, Magandiya replies. So in other words, what's the difference between the charcoal pit for the man cured of leprosy and the charcoal pit for the man when he had leprosy? Previously, the fire was painful to touch, The fire is now painful to touch, and previously too the fire was painful to touch. But when the man was a leper with sores and blisters, being devoured, etc., and his faculties impaired, thus the fire was actually painful to touch, he mistakenly perceived it as pleasant, because of course it was taking away a greater pain. So and then he goes on. He says, still with the leper. So we're still with the leper who's devoured by worms, scratching at the scabs off his open stores. Right? The fouler and more evil smelling and more infected the opening of his wounds would become, yet he would find a certain measure of satisfaction and enjoyment in scratching the opening of his wounds. Yet they would find a certain measure of satisfaction, enjoying dependence on the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. So too, Magandiya, beings are not free from lust of sensual pleasure who are devoured by craving. So just as the leper is overcome by all this suffering and has to create a greater suffering to get rid of the present suffering through the charcoal, so the problem with our indulgence is that it bites back. So remember, when we're addicted to something, when we are dependent on something, the action becomes compulsive, the habit overtakes us. And then the consequences of that, of course, are grief when you lose what you're dependent on, frustration when you can't get what you want. There's, of course, anxiety there that you might lose it anyway. And then there always comes that point with something that we're enjoying where it becomes boring, where it loses that oomph, it loses that buzz, it loses that level of excitement. And the boredom then makes us chase for the next excitement. So there's the pain, there's the dissatisfaction within the sensual pleasure. And that's the danger, right? So there's the gratification. The danger of it is the future suffering, and the escape, of course, is renunciation. So he's here now talking about a king. So I too have Magandiya. I've never seen or heard a king enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of pleasure, without abandoning sensual pleasure, without removing the fever of sensual pleasure, was able to abide free of thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace, and who is able and who will be able to so abide. So here the king, who has all the pleasures of his life, still doesn't have this inner peace. But these recluses and Brahmins who abided and abide and will abide free of thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace, all do so after having understood as they actually are the origin, the disappearance. So pleasure, there's always a moment where the pleasure begins and the moment it ends, the sense of gratification, but then the danger, the consequence of attachment, and the escape in the case of sensual pleasure. And after abandoning craving for sensual pleasure, removing the fever for sensual pleasures, they abided and abide and will abide, free from thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. So here he's really trying to get Magandiya to understand how important it is to let go of his idea that sensual pleasures are Nibbana. And this is what he says, you see. He asks him, well, he now utters this verse: the greatest of all gains is health. Nibbana is the greatest bliss. The Eightfold Path is the best of paths, for it leads safely to the deathless. And Magandiya repeats the first 2 lines: the greatest of all gains is health. Nibbana is the greatest bliss. So he's not quite got it, because he says, when the Buddha says, now what do you mean by health? What do you mean by Nibbana? Magandiya rubbed the limbs with his hands and said, this is that health. In other words, this body, Master Gautama, and this is that Nibbana. So I am now happy and healthy. So often when you if you say to somebody that Buddhism is about the end of suffering, unsatisfactoriness, and they say, well, actually, well, I'm happy, I mean, I'm content with my life and I'm happy and I don't see a problem. So these people are hedonists in the sense that they think that the only happiness you can get in life is based upon your sensual pleasures. So now he gives them another simile. He says, what if a man is born blind and somebody wants, and he heard a man with good eyesight say, good indeed, sirs, is a white cloth, beautiful, spotless, and clean. And when he heard that, this blind man, he went in search of one, and he accepted a cloth from somebody. Good indeed is a white cloth, beautiful, spotless, and clean. So but he was cheated by this man. He was given a dirty, soiled garment, and he put it on, and he was perfectly satisfied with it, because it wasn't that he was knowing or seeing, but out of faith in the man with good eyesight. He didn't think he was being cheated. So to Magandiya, other sects are blind and visionlessness. They are visionless. They do not know health. They do not see Nibbana. So in other words, they didn't add the other two verses. The greatest of all gains is health. Nibbana is the greatest bliss, but the greatest of all, the Eightfold Path is the best of paths, and it leads safely to the deathless, right? Which is another way of saying Nibbana. And then he points out to Magandiya, this body is a disease, a tumor, a dart, a calamity, an affliction, referring to this body to say that this is that health, this is that Nibbana. You do not have the noble vision, Magandiya, by means of which you might know what real health is and what is Nibbana. Now, at this point, it seems, I think he's finally getting through to Magandiya, and he asks him to teach him the true Dharma. And the Buddha says, well, if a man is born blind and the physician tries to heal him, and then the vision, although he tried his best, the vision would not arise and be purified. He wouldn't be able to see. So what do you think, Magandiya? Would that doctor reap weariness and disappointment? And of course, Magandiya says, yes. So it's the same with me and you, Magandiya. I can go to all this business of trying to teach you, but you won't accept it, and that would be wearisome and troublesome for me. But Magandiya now insists and says, well, now give me a chance, teach me the Dharma, tell me what you understand by health and Nibbana. So then he says, then the Buddha replies again, a man born blind, then a man would cheat him with a dirty, soiled garment, and the physician would come along with all these things and would cure that man of his blindness. And then that man would wake up and realize that this fellow cheated him, giving him a dirty old cloth instead of this white, beautiful cloth. So, okay, he says, I will teach you the Dharma. And here he says, together with the arising of your vision, your desire, the lust for the five aggregates affected by clinging might be abandoned. Once you begin to understand that the path of indulgence is not going to get you anywhere. And then you might say to yourself, I've long been tricked and cheated and defrauded by this mind. For when clinging, I've been clinging just to material form. I've been clinging just to feeling. I've been clinging to the body and its senses. I've been clinging to trying to make myself happy, feeling. I've been clinging to my ideas. I've been clinging to all my habits and even consciousness. Now, when this clinging comes to an end, then, with this clinging, of course, birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, and despair come to me. Such is the origin of this mass of suffering, this very desire for sensual pleasure. And then Magandiya says, oh, you know, he's very. I have confidence in Master Gautama. Master Gautama is capable of teaching me the Dharma in such a way as might rise up from this seat, cured of my blindness. So now he's really opening up to the Buddha's teaching. So then he's saying, so the Buddha says, well, if you associate with good men, true men, and you hear the true Dharma, when you hear the true Dharma, you will practice in accordance with the true Dharma. When you practice in accordance with the true Dharma, you will see and know for yourself. These are diseases, tumors and darts. But here, these diseases, tumors and darts cease without remainder. So that's, of course, the final liberation in Arahat. With the cessation of my clinging comes cessation of becoming. The cessation of becoming, cessation of birth. Cessation of birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair cease. Such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. So here, of course, this is dependent origination. So he's teaching him how desire, overcoming desire, brings an end to this process of constantly wanting to become. So this has really opened up Magandiya's eyes, and he's got nothing but the usual paean of the Buddha, the usual praise of the Buddha. Master Gautama is magnificent. Master Gautama has made the Dharma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who is lost, holding up a lamp in the dark to those who can see. I go to Master Gautama for refuge, to the Dharma and the Sangha of bhikkhus. I would receive the going forth, so he wants to become a monk, the full admission. So the Buddha replies in the usual way, that's very good, but because you belong to another sect, you need to go through a probation of 4 months. And in his newfound humility, Magandiya says, I'll be on probation for 4 years. And then he finally gets the full ordination. And then Magandiya receives the full going forth from the Blessed One, receiving full admission. And soon, not long after his full admission, dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute, the Venerable Magandiya, by realizing for himself with direct knowledge here and now, entered upon and abided in that supreme goal of the holy life, for the sake of which clansmen rightly go forth from the home into homelessness. He directly knew birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done. There is no more coming into any state of becoming. And the Venerable Magandiya became one of the Arahats. So here we have a very different story based on somebody who is devoted to sensual pleasure. And his path, of course, is to begin to renounce, to let go of it. And eventually he liberates himself. Now, when they say in no length of time, the commentaries gloss that with 25 years in the jungle or forests. So I suppose cosmically it's a very small length of time, 25 years. So we can't hope for immediate success, but at least we have the way, which is one of restraint and finally not seeking happiness as such, permanent happiness in sensual pleasure. So I can only hope that this story of Magandiya has been of some use to you, and that you will put it into, of course, excellent practice, and by doing so, be liberated from all suffering sooner rather than later. So we can do a bit of practice.